Thank you, Jonathan. Right, everyone, welcome back. It is nice to have a shape to the week. Poor sad soul that I am. Judy's with me as well. Recently from the loom, working very hard to support 2 history sessions. I'm sure she'll get double the pay. We have had trouble this week with the notes, by which I mean some of you poor souls had lost them because I sent them out a fortnight ago, which is why I've sent them out again this morning, just in case. So apart from that, welcome. Nice to see you back, Judy, looking as smart as ever. Off you go.
Thank you very much, Martin. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be back. I hope you've had a good rest during the summer and stayed well. Very important that you stay well. And it is nice to be back in a sort of routine again. Martin's right. It's been August has seemed a bit shapeless somehow without our Monday mornings every fortnight. So lovely to see familiar faces again. And again, can't emphasize enough, thank you very much for your loyalty. I think loyalty is such an important thing for people to have. Sort of something that people don't realize how important it is. So thank you very much indeed for your loyalty. Very important. I don't mean just to me, I mean just important to have that kind of a nature where loyalty matters so much and sticking to things. So King John and Magna Carta. Circumstances leading to conflict with the barons. Everything seemed to go wrong for John. He seemed to be an unlucky sort of person. And first of all, he lost Normandy. He'd already lost Normandy in 1204. And the price of everything went up. Don't mean the price of food, but taxes went up. Taxes went up very dramatically. They were in the gift, well, not the gift, they were the concern of the king. We didn't have any parliament in those days. If the king wanted to put taxes up, then he did. Like a dictatorship or a tyranny. And he had put the taxes up for the barons, for the landowners. And all sorts of new taxes had been sort of invented by his advisors. So the barons felt that they were being hit in all directions by demands for money. More and more money, more and more money. We might argue, well, they could afford it. They were the rich ones, they could afford to pay, but that didn't prevent them from feeling that they were being exploited, they were being taken for granted. Nobody likes to feel that they're being taken for granted and assumptions are being made that they are just cash cows, to use a modern phrase. More and more demands for more and more money and failure. They wouldn't have minded so much if the money they were handing over was resulting in success, but it wasn't. It was resulting in failure and defeat. So, again, to use a modern phrase, double whammy. Another problem, that the king was being seen as a tyrant, conducting affairs according to his whims and moods, and we know that he was unreliable, that he had poor judgment, that he was unpredictable. He extended royal powers over wardship, marriage of heiresses, and particularly very vindictive when it came to his people he perceived as his enemies. So we think now, using modern psychological insights, that he had a tendency to paranoia, imagining enemies everywhere. and punishing people who were under suspicion rather than that it was proved that they'd done something dreadful. Very much the idea of frightening people into subservience, into obedience, scaring people, using what we would say totally over-the-top punishments. That didn't really impress anybody. He thought it was making him seem powerful and strong and determined, and that it would impress people. And it didn't. It had exactly the opposite effect. That he was unpredictable, lacking in balance, and a nasty, cruel, vindictive sort of person. And that reputation has stuck to him. Vicious punishments. And then the quarrel with the Pope was the sort of the last straw, the one thing that monarchs in the Middle Ages should not do, should not have done, was argue with the Pope, get into conflict with the Church, which was becoming more and more powerful with every year that passed. And he managed to quarrel with the Church, with the Pope, and get himself excommunicated, and the church, the country put under an interdict. That was the last straw for many of the barons who up till then had been loyal. They knew by their feudal obligations that they should be loyal to their overlord, and their overlord was the king and then God. And they sometimes put the two together, that if you were disloyal to your overlord, it was the same as being disloyal to God, because their concept of the feudal system really was that God had established this system, that every man had a lord. Everybody had to be obedient to the person above them in the social hierarchy, and therefore barons must obey the king, who would give them their land. But now they were losing all sense of loyalty because they felt that John was unworthy of their loyalty in so many ways. So he quarreled with the Pope. He was taking vast sums of money from the Church in tax. He was obsessed with money. He was obsessed with power, and sensibly realizing that the bankrupt king's no good. If you've got to put an army in the field, you've got to have money. And so he was gaining money in every way he could think of, legitimate ways and illegitimate ways. So being excommunicated from the Church was absolutely the last straw. He was endangering the souls of his subjects now, not just their bodies, and he wasn't just sort of virtually bankrupting them. He was putting their souls in danger. And so Stephen Langton, churchman, was heading the baronial opposition. So what were the other issues? First of all, the northern barons were the ones who felt alienated, more alienated than the barons had held land in the south. So the north-south problem, which still exists today, was alive and kicking in the reign of King John. The feeling that the farther away from London you lived or held your land, the less you were considered. You were seen as not quite belonging, not quite proper English. And that feeling still exists today, north of the Trent, a different country. It might date back to the Romans, who had divided this country into two and had a separate capital in York. So York was seen as quite civilized, and Durham was seen as quite civilized, but the rest was sort of primitive, and you might get even eaten by the natives if you went north of the Trent. And there are one or two people who still feel rather like that today. If they go north of Watford Gap, something awful might happen to them. It's sort of they're going into a totally uncivilized area. Anything could happen. Well, that existed in the 13th century. The northern barons definitely felt more alienated by the king's behaviour than the southern barons. They became what we could now call dissidents. and they were disloyal, and they didn't feel ashamed about being disloyal. Another problem, an accumulation of resentments, a building up of grievances, steady increase in demands for service and money for what we call aids, which meant the way the request was made, it was sort of asking for money for a specific campaign or a specific need. The king would ask for aid, making it sound as though he was a charity asking for money because there was a very good cause involved. That's what I called an aid. Sometimes it was called a relief, another fancy word, a weasel word. Instead of calling it a taxation, new tax, a relief for some specific reason. The king needed relief for a particular campaign, or to rescue somebody from hostages from a particular castle where they were being held. It was just a weasel way of getting more money out of the barons. And fines. Fines had increased dramatically. So if you stepped out of line, you were whacked with an enormous fine, and that was causing massive resentment. So a lot of the barons had resorted to borrowing money. They hadn't got ready cash. They owed money to the king, money they didn't think they should have owed to the king, and in desperation they resorted to Jewish moneylenders. And the whole idea, I know I've said this before, but Jewish moneylenders were allowed to charge interest. English moneylenders, and there weren't many of them, for obvious reasons, weren't allowed to charge interest because usury was a sin. The church forbade usury. The church forbade the taking of extra money. If you lent somebody money, you paid them back exactly the amount that you borrowed. They must not charge anything for the loan. The Jews, on the other hand, didn't have that restriction, which is why most of the money lending was Jewish. So the barons were borrowing money and it caused enormous resentment that they had been reduced to doing this. They saw it as a humiliation. It should never have happened. They shouldn't have been reduced to going and borrowing money from foreigners. So they owed a large amount of money, and they were being pursued by the king. Pay up, pay up. And interestingly, the king protected the Jewish moneylenders, because when the Jewish moneylender died, the money owed went to the king. So another sneaky way of getting money out of his subjects. That caused resentment. Why was he supporting the Jews against his own people? Why was he sort of grinding the faces of the barons? Because they weren't as wealthy as he seemed to imagine. Hence the debts, that they'd have to borrow money. And then the third reason, new exactions, new customs duties. The king was thinking up new ways of squeezing the barons. Almost every day, a new idea. 1214, 3 marks per night fee for scutage. Scutage was shield money. You could pay not to attend a campaign. You had to pay money if you didn't turn up, as your feudal obligations meant you to do. You could pay a sort of fee to be excused for whatever reason. Either you were ill, or you were abroad, or whatever. The king put that money up without any consultation, just decided. Widespread refusal to pay. So loyalty is going out of the window. The barons are totally sick of constant increases in the money they were expected to pay. And what were they getting in return? Nothing. Why should they pay more money to a defeated, disgraced king. He didn't seem to be able to win any battles on the continent. He was losing. Where was their money going? It was just like putting it down, like we say, putting it down a drain, putting it in a hole in the ground. It wasn't being spent well. What was the king doing with all this money? And then the Battle of Bouvines was a turning point, and the barons decided that they really couldn't put up with this any longer, that the king had to be brought to book. He had to be controlled. He was totally out of control, they felt. So 1214, defeated on the continent, and the response was, as they had anticipated, give me more money. I need more money. The reason I was defeated was I haven't got a large enough army and I haven't got enough weapons and so on and so forth. More money, more money, more money. So they decided that they really couldn't cope with this any longer. So they met at Stamford in Lincolnshire and began to attack royal castles in the Midlands, one of which, Kenilworth, that many of us have visited and we're familiar with. And then in 2013, the baronial armies took London. I mean, this is a civil war. And Archbishop Langton, Stephen Langton, very cleverly, there are always some people around who've got negotiating skills, conciliating skills. He managed to organise a truce. And both sides agreed to meet at Runnymede, which is between Staines and Windsor. And there would be a ceremony in which the barons had drawn up a list based on their grievances, so correcting these grievances and saying the king must never do any of these, the following again, but extending it in a very, very lengthy document, restrictions on royal power, but also including civil or civic rights, not just restriction on royal power. And that the king wouldn't sign it. It's all shown with a pen in his hand. The king couldn't write. He could read, but not write. That does seem strange to us because we were brought up, and for centuries before us, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But that wasn't always the case. Writing is much more difficult to teach than reading. And so, strangely, it wasn't always the case that people learned to write. They learned to read, but not to write. And until the 19th century, that was very much the case. And we know a lot of research being done using marriage certificates where people had to sign their names, except they couldn't. So they were allowed to write an X, and the clerk or the registrar wrote the person's name at the side. And so we know how few people, even in the 19th century, in certain working class areas, how few people could actually write their names. Just that simple act, they couldn't do it. Or if they did it, it was very, very badly written. They'd hardly ever held a pen in their lives. So all these pictures of the king holding a pen are inaccurate. He sealed the charter. And that's where signet rings came in. That important people had their coat of arms put onto a ring, so the ring never left their finger, or hardly ever, so it was safe, because that was their means of identity. Instead of a number or a password or whatever we used to identify ourselves, they carried it on their finger in the form of a signet ring with their coat of arms or a device of some sort. Later it became a fancy monogram, just their initials all entwined in a special way. And so the clerks would heat the sealing wax, put a blob of sealing wax at later it became more advanced, a large blob of sealing wax on the document, and the king or whoever would press their ring hard into the sealing wax, and when it dried and hardened, there was the impression and only that person could have done it because they were wearing the ring. So it was a sort of guarantee that it was genuine, that they had genuinely agreed to the terms of the document. Then later for royalty, royal seals were created, but they were often it was like countersigning with the signet ring. So there was a seal with a string, sort of a ribbon attached, which could be put onto documents, a ready-made seal, but then I say it was guaranteed by the actual signet ring. So sealed, well, we still say sealed and signed because of the old tradition that people couldn't necessarily write. They couldn't write their name. They couldn't authorize something by writing their name like we do. They used their signet ring. So the agreement was made. I mean, Stephen Langton deserves a lot of credit for having brought the two kind of warring sides together, but the king accepted that he really was on the ropes by this time. And so he agreed to meet with his barons. And so they met and everything went well. The king had agreed, and it looked as though peace had descended on this very, very disturbed and divided country. But in fact, King John was absolutely furious at having been cornered like this and reduced to having to obey traitors. And so very, very quickly after having sealed Magna Carta, having agreed to it, he denounced the barons as traitors and went over their heads and appealed to the Pope, because we were now belonged to the Pope in the feudal system. He was now the king's feudal overlord and therefore protector. So the king then appealed to the Pope and said, look what my people have done. Look, they've turned against me. What are we going to do about it? And the civil war resumed. So Magna Carta wasn't the great turning point in the reign of John that we perhaps think it was. It wasn't the end of the civil war between the king and his men and the barons and their men. But that leaves us, and the king died the following year as well. He died in 1216. So we're left with Magna Carta, which has gained a fantastic reputation over the years, especially in America. They regard Magna Carta with enormous reverence. Almost it's sort of an extension of the Bible. They revere Magna Carta as a sort of beginning of a statement of human rights. Well, to some extent that was true, but they have placed it on an enormous pedestal, which it perhaps when it's investigated and analysed, it doesn't really deserve. So why is Magna Carta so highly regarded in America and here, to be fair? For many, many years, it was regarded as the basis of our democracy. You know, our much vaunted democracy, our democracy that we sort of tried to sell to the rest of the world as the finest form of government. And many people think, yes, it started with Magna Carta. That's how it all began. Well, that is, again, exaggerating its importance. The other problem with Magna Carta was that the king renounced it almost immediately, and it's actually a charter in his son's reign that is the real Magna Carta, because it had amendments. But people prefer to think of Magna Carta as this wonderful turning point, a sort of watershed, you know, from tyranny to democracy. Well, that is giving it far too much significance. So first of all, there are 63, or some people think 60, but 63 separate clauses most of them are attending or dealing with specific baronial grievances. They don't apply to the common man or common woman like us. They are the barons fighting back. It's between the king and the barons. So many of the clauses refer to the barons. A number of articles do refer to government and justice, restriction on the powers of sheriffs. And the most famous articles are number 39 and number 40. Now, number 39, no freeman shall be arrested or imprisoned or deprived of his freehold or outlawed or banished or in any way ruined, an interesting phrase, or in any way ruined, nor will we take or order action against him except by the lawful judgment of his equals and according to the law of the land. That sounds really very modern and very inclusive, covers all aspects. But the interesting thing is it says no free man. And in feudal times, that excluded the majority of the population because they weren't free. Our ancestors were mainly serfs, unfree peasants that held their land from a feudal overlord. They weren't free. This is actually quite exclusive, not inclusive. No free man shall be arrested, etc., etc. So just to quickly look at the feudal system, most of our ancestors, most people in a feudal medieval village under the feudal system were unfree. They were serfs or villeins. They belonged to their overlord, the lord of the manor, sir somebody, a knight. If you wanted to get your freedom, well, there were various ways of getting your freedom. There were romantic ways and then more practical ways. Romantic ways were if your overlord had, let's say, been on the Crusades or been on a campaign in Normandy or somewhere else in France, trying to win the Angevin Empire back from the King of France. Perhaps he had said before he left, when he'd gone to the church and prayed to a specific saint, and vowed that if he came back safe and sound, unharmed, then he would release, he would give freedom to, well, then you think of a number, 4, 6, whatever, of his serfs as a thank offering. That was one way you could get your freedom, that you were one of the lucky 4, 5, 6, whatever, to be chosen. Or maybe this is the Lord of the Manor's son had fallen into the local river, and you, lucky peasant, happened to be walking past at the time, fished him out of the river and delivered him to his grateful father, who then said, for this wonderful thing that you've done, I will give you your freedom. So unless you went around pushing boys into rivers and then rescuing them, this was a kind of unlikely scenario, but it did happen. It did happen that people would, the Lord of the Manor, in a fit of gratitude, would grant freedom. Sometimes on special occasions, like an anniversary of some kind. Again, it was a thank offering. The Lord of the Manor would grant freedom to a very specific number of serfs. Another thing you could do, of course, was buy your freedom. You could pay for your freedom, but it would take years and years and years of very careful saving, and there was no obligation on the part of the Lord of the Manor to accept the money. You can go to him with your bag of money and say, I would like to buy my freedom, and he can say, push off. I'm not in the market for selling, for granting anybody their freedom. The most popular way, of course, was to run away, to leg it. if you could stay free or evade recapture for a year and a day, you were officially free. The day was calculated. If you could manage to be free somehow for a year and a day, you could then officially, legally claim your freedom. And that's what a lot of our ancestors did. Mostly they were recaptured within 24 hours because the Lord of the Manor set the hunting dogs on you, gave the dogs something to sniff that had belonged to you, and then let the dogs go. They were hunting dogs, so they very, very quickly found the poor serf, usually hiding in woods, travelling at night, and hiding during the day in forests or woods. So the dogs usually found them, and they were dragged back to the village and branded as runaways, so that everyone would recognise then that they were dodgy and keep an eye on them. And if you kept on running away, eventually they chopped part of your foot off, so you couldn't. So that was a risk. Some people managed it. Some people definitely did manage to do that. They managed to stay in, well, kind of freedom, as a kind of outlaws for a year and a day, and then they could claim to be free. But the vast majority didn't do that. They were unfree. So this clause doesn't apply to an awful lot of people. It's a very good clause, but it is limited to free men. That means barons. There wasn't sort of thing in the middle class, but merchants and people who had a shop would be free. People who lived in towns and cities were usually free. But the majority of people were unfree peasants.
Judy, you several times today and in recent sessions, you've talked about our ancestors paying taxes, and talked about various numeric activities. Now, our great unwashed ancestors, when did they start getting numerate? Is there any?
Well, Protestantism had a huge effect when people were encouraged to read the Bible, and because they couldn't read, so that was
Right.
that. So in Tudor times, village schools were set up, but it was really the 19th century before people could
Actually
count and read and write
and
yeah.
juggle figures and sums and things.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
It's hard for us to sort of accept how ignorant our ancestors were, and they didn't leave their village. The other problem, of course, if you weren't free, you belonged to the Lord of the Manor. You weren't a slave. We didn't have slavery in this country anymore as such, but you were like a semi-slave. Serf meant that you were bound to your village. You were bound to the Lord of the Manor. You owned, he owned all the land. He lent you part of his land, and in return, you did his farm work for nothing. Farmed your own land and supported yourself, and you grew your own food for your own family, as peasants all over the world are doing. But you also had to do his farm work for no pay. In return, you had a cottage and land, enough land for subsistence farming. So it was a system with a lot of advantages for the Lord of the Manor, and not many advantages for the poor serf. And they weren't supposed to leave their village. That's what they were called. They were called bondmen. They were bound to their lord. They were bound. They weren't supposed to. If they travelled to sell, let's say they'd got surplus eggs or surplus chickens, they were allowed to go to the nearest market town, but they had a sort of passport that they carried with them. They couldn't read it, but officials could. They had to carry something to say that their Lord of the Manor had let them out during daylight. They got to be back before it got dark. If they didn't get back, it was assumed that they were trying to run away, and the dogs came out after them, and they got branded as runaways, even if they weren't really, even if they got delayed on the return journey. They must be back before it got dark. So it is like a form of slavery. So 40, to no one will we sell. This time it doesn't say free men, it says to no one. To no one will we sell, to no one will we refuse or delay right or justice. To no one will we sell, to no one will we refuse or delay right or justice. Delay, very important. This wasn't always honoured, but we did have a reputation ahead of other countries that you didn't just put people in prison on suspicion and leave them there to rot, that they should be brought to a court of law and tried. Now, sometimes that wasn't followed. The king didn't follow it. Again, it was one of the restrictions on the king, that he was one of the things he used to sort of terrorize people was just to put them in a castle dungeon and leave them there, just under suspicion. No justice, because they hadn't been brought to court. They hadn't had a trial. But we were ahead of other countries in this regard. Habeas corpus in the reign of Charles II ratified this and tightened up on it, that in this country we have to be brought to trial very, very soon after we were accused. We were held in remand, but we must be brought to trial. Can't just leave people in prison. And as we know, this happens in many other countries, that people are just left in prison and they die in prison and they've never been brought to trial. So they have never had justice. So the clause 40 is inclusive because it says to no one. It doesn't limit it to free men. To no one will we sell, to no one will we refuse or delay right or justice. So powerful word. We mustn't delay justice. Now, the barons were authorised to appoint a committee of 25. Now, this is the beginning. It isn't Parliament, not yet. Parliament started in the reign of John's son, Henry III. We're to do that very shortly. The beginning of our famed democracy. But this committee of 25 were appointed to monitor the king's compliance. So it is a very important limit on the king's power. And they would take appropriate action if he reneged. So this is the beginning of our famous democracy, limiting a tyrant's power or a dictator's power or a monarch's power. Very important. And that was the most humiliating part of this, that the king had to accept that he was going to have limitations on his power and his authority, remembering that because he was small, short in height, and because he had been mocked by his brothers, he was very touchy about his power and authority, which is why he had been throwing his weight around so mightily. So you can imagine how humiliating and awful he found this limitation of his power, the 25. Of course, he accepted it because he was surrounded by hostile barons. At Runnymede, he seemed very compliant and very, very, very friendly. He wasn't swearing or anything, and he wasn't trying to escape or cause any trouble. He had been very compliant, but then he wasn't in a position to be anything else. But as soon as he possibly could, he renounced the charter and fought back against these disloyal rats, as he thought, these sort of disloyal rat barons. His compliance certainly didn't last very long. So the limiting of the tyrant's authority was actually ratified in his son's reign, in the reign of Henry III. So the charter at Runnymede gets all the publicity, as often happens historically. Either a person or a document gets more sort of publicity, really, than it actually or they actually deserve. King John did appear to have turned over a new leaf just for a little while after the. It's easy to say the signing of the document. It wasn't signed. The ratification of the document of Magna Carta. It seemed to have worked. The barons were triumphant. We've pinned him down. We've controlled him. But you know, they rejoiced a bit too soon, because it only lasted a few weeks, and then he was back to his old tricks, getting revenge and punishing, or trying to punish, the barons who had done this terrible, humiliating thing to him, trying to control his power, and particularly control the amount of money that he needed to gain back the Angevin Empire. And it's hard for us to sort of understand this absolute obsession with getting back the lost lands. They were being gradually taken away by the King of France, and it hurt. We had had this huge empire in France, this huge holding of land, and it was disappearing. And even that the homeland, Normandy, had been lost. You know, the origin of the family, that had been lost. It was just one humiliation after another. We sort of accept it now. Oh, well, yes, well, that happened. But at the time, it was a most awful humiliation for the kings of England to see the land in France disappearing. And, well, it just seemed that nobody could do anything much about it. The king kept asking for more money, and that didn't seem to make any real difference to how successful we were in France. The French king was very successful in mounting campaigns, and we just lost more and more land. And of course, eventually, by Tudor times, we lost all of the land in France except for Calais and the area around Calais, 20-mile radius. Some people think they'd say 25, but usually it says 20 miles. The area around Calais, the Pale it was called, was English land. And then, of course, in the reign of Mary Tudor, we lost that. So no more French Empire. And that's when you can sort of date nationalism and say that's when England became a sort of totally separated country, and France became our enemy. Traditionally, been our enemy since these battles took place, but mainly because nationalism meant that we were separated. We weren't looking across the channel all the time, and our kings weren't spending half their reign in France, which of course had been the case. The other thing that happened was that kings started to speak English. I mean, another surprise is they didn't. They spoke Norman French. They were really very foreign. But now, because they had lost the empire, something good came out of it. Our kings became more patriotic. They became just totally English kings, instead of looking across the channel all the time, either spending more time there than they did in England, like Richard I, or fighting to get the lost lands back unsuccessfully. At least, but when we'd lost it all, we sort of knew where we stood. We hated the French, and that continued for many, many, many years. In fact, until the reign of Edward VII, with the Entente Cordiale. Lots of eyebrows raised at the idea of being friendly with the French. They were our enemies. The Germans were our friends. The French were our enemies. And so even the Crimean War, it's very, very difficult for our commanders to realize that the Russians were our enemy, and we were actually allied with the French. They kept talking about the French as the enemy. Oh, Lord Raglan did, and he'd been reminded the French are our allies, my lord. Oh yes, so they are. So this Magna Carta really does is a kind of watershed, but not for the reason that many people think. The other thing that's interesting is, why is it so important? Why is Magna Carta regarded as so important in the United States? And Martin's found this wonderful picture of Eleanor Roosevelt. holding a copy. I mean, the one fantastic thing about the Magna Carta is how thorough it is. Incredibly thorough and detailed. We tend to have a rather contemptuous attitude towards the past because they weren't scientific and they didn't know all the stuff that we know. We tend to think the same about their bureaucracy, that it was a bit lightweight and limited. And then you look at the Magna Carta, it's very, very detailed and extremely well expressed to cover all eventualities, as most legal documents are, of course, today, where you cover everything. In case there's a loophole, you try and not have any loopholes. And there's a lovely photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt holding a copy of the Magna Carta. Sorry, she's holding a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is considered by many as a direct development from the Magna Carta. So all subsequent attempts to make rules to apply to everybody were based on this great, well, Magna Carta means the Great Charter, the Great Charter of Liberties. So if we ignore the fact that the Charter of Liberties was actually quite limited to free men, and many of the liberties were specifically for barons, didn't really apply to anybody else, it is a turning point. And then Martin has found, has copied out, and you can see how detailed it is. It's absolutely incredible how much detail it goes into. It's a masterpiece, really, of a wonderful legal document. But it didn't grant the freedom that the Americans perhaps believe it granted, because they don't understand the feudal system. They've never had one, of course. So they don't really understand how it worked, how limiting it was. What a very strong, sort of like the caste system in India, as powerful as that. You were born into a position and you kept that position throughout your life. It's very hard to climb out of the peasant class into what later became known as the middle class. Very hard indeed. Hardly anybody achieved it. What really made the difference to the feudal system, of course, or what rocked it to its foundations, was the Black Death. Because the Black Death shook society so dramatically, and lots of lords of the manor died, and the inhabitants of the village decided, or the manor decided, this was an opportunity. Lord of the manor had died. His hunting dogs had sort of run away. Either they disappeared. They didn't even need to run anymore. They didn't need to hide in forests. There wasn't anybody to catch them. They could leave. Many villages were completely deserted. There are 17, I think I've mentioned this before. There are 17 in Warwickshire. The lost villages of Warwickshire, they're called. And there are a lot of villages from all over, but particularly the ones in Warwickshire have been identified. They're there in the Domesday Book with a healthy population, healthy in both regards, a strong population of maybe 200, which is quite big for a medieval village. 200 men, so it's 200 families. And then they disappeared. We know that from tax records, where each village is identified and how much tax they owed. They disappeared. They weren't there anymore. They'd gone. When air transport was invented, and you could fly, and helicopters and balloons and so forth, and you could fly over Warwickshire, you can actually see where these villages were. Like fossilized villages, it shows under the soil. You can see the outline of the village. I know I've mentioned this before. On the ground, very hard to see. But if you're above, looking down, you can see the outline. You can see where the main road was, or the high street, and you can see where the cottages were, and even see where their gardens were. And you can see where the mill was and where the church was. But there's nothing above ground. It's just pasture. If it's farmland, if it's being used, then you can't see this very well. But if it's pasture, if it's for sheep or cows, then it shows up. You can see the outline of where the village was. So what had happened? Either everybody died, which actually wasn't very likely that absolutely everybody died, or quite a few people had died and the others had legged it. They'd gone to a town where they would be anonymous and nobody was going to hunt them down for a year and a day, because the new lord of the manor sometimes lived abroad, or you know, they had to find who the new lord of the manor was, because if the whole family had died of the lord of the manor, who was the heir? Who was the new one? Had to find him or her, most likely him. In the meantime, the serfs decided that they were going to claim freedom, or they stayed in the village and they set fire to the manorial records, which proved that they were serfs. So when the new lord of the manor eventually turned up, lo and behold, everyone in the village said, "We are free," and you can't prove otherwise, because all the records had disappeared. So that was the beginning of the end for the feudal system. And the last claim that somebody owned somebody else was a court case in the reign, in the latter part of Elizabeth I's reign, where somebody actually claimed that somebody else belonged to him. It was a woman. They claimed that this woman was by the feudal system still belonged to him, and it failed. The case was thrown out of court, that the feudal system had died, and therefore legally she was a free woman. So basically, Magna Carta isn't quite the wonderful document that the Americans believe it to be, and that the Victorians believed it to be. The Victorians were very proud of our democracy, because we were ahead of other countries in so many ways. I'm very proud of the fact. And we were sort of selling democracy to our colonies and our empire. We were setting up similar regimes in other countries and saying, you know, we've got this brilliant system of voting and choosing, and our kings and queens don't have very much power. They're constitutional monarchs. We recommend this system to you. Magna Carta was really, say, up there almost with the Bible. And many books have been written just about Magna Carta. You wouldn't imagine there was enough really to have a book, but yes, there are books just on Magna Carta. But then recently people have gone into a lot more detail and examination, and not found fault with it exactly, but resolved some of the problems and sorted out what some of the clauses mean, but basically rationalized it. So said it's not as marvelous as people used to think it was, but it was a turning point. And democracy in its earliest forms, the beginning of Parliament is in the reign of Henry III. The idea of having elected, chosen representatives going to London, going to Westminster, and making decisions on behalf of others. That is real democracy, where ordinary people have just, but again, it didn't involve serfs. They didn't have any rights at all. So we have to be careful not to think that it's involved everybody. So very grateful to Martin for having written out all the clauses. I mean, absolutely fascinating.
I only cut and pasted it, Judy, but I was fascinated to see the minutiae, the little, almost like domestic things,
yeah,
that were captured within it. And you think, oh,
it's just so incredibly thorough. It was like they pinned the king down, and they were going to
off their chest.
Yes, exactly. But the main thing, as often as nowadays, was money. Like, you know, the economy stupid. It was to do with money, and I think we can relate to that. Taxes going up, or people exploiting, or the king exploiting, or the government exploiting people. We have a right to complain. We have a system. But imagine if we didn't have a system. If King Charles was just demanding more and more money and saying, well, I want to go and fight on the continent and it's costing a fortune and you've got to pay, how we would feel. We would feel that we wanted to protest about it, or say, well, at least bring us home some successes. You know, King Charles was asking for all his money.
Getting lower.
And was a loser. Yeah. Which also explains why his bad deeds were exaggerated. It was people's way of retaliating and saying, you know, he hasn't brought us any glory in the field in warfare. He hasn't. All he's done is lose. He's a loser, and he's expecting us to pay for these losses. And he's a really, really horrible bad man. Anyway, next session, he's going to die.
Hooray!
And his little son, who's only 9 years old, will come to the throne. And that was it's one of the theories as to why John wasn't replaced earlier, that his heir was a child, and how would that benefit the country? I mean, some of the barons weren't totally selfish. They were beginning to think in terms of the country's good. They weren't just thinking about themselves. And how would it benefit the country if they got rid of John? Maybe not kill him, but put him in prison and force him to abdicate in favour of his son. How would that help? It was never a very healthy situation to have a child as the monarch. So that might have been why they held back and didn't actually assassinate him or take him on in the field of battle and arrange for him to be killed, because he only had a child to succeed. But it's also a great compliment in a way to the fact that the country was well organised and well governed, thanks to Henry I and Henry II. That when John died, his son was only 9 years old, and the succession went ahead without any protest or without any complaints or without anybody saying I should be the king. It happened in a very civilized way, and that says a great deal about the development of this country and the very great importance of what other kings had done. That this country was stable and able to cope with a crisis, which was a child coming to the throne. He had to be crowned with his mother's, some people say his mother's bracelet, but it wasn't. It was a little sort of diadem that belonged to his mother, because the crown would obviously have dropped right over his head. It would look ridiculous. The crown was much too big. So he had to wear what some books say, some chroniclers say his mother's bracelet, that would probably be too small, and others say it was a diadem that belonged to his mother that they used to crown this child as the King of England. So that's what we'll do the death of John, which is interesting. Whether it's true that he died of a surfeit of pears and cider, which sounds
quite tasty.
Sounds a bit, well, I'm going to say could be a bit toxic, but he probably didn't die of. They were all saying people died of surfeits. Because they didn't know what they died of, so they just looked at the last meal and blamed that. Surfeit of lamprey, surfeit of pears and cider. He was very ill anyway, so he didn't die of. I mean, people who grew pears were really quite indignant about this. The pears were being blamed, and the people who produced cider were not very happy either. So we'll do the death of John, and then the beginning of Henry III's reign, which is a very interesting one. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Judy. Another fascinating session.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Can I remind you all,
Thank you, Judy.
Jonathan will be on duty next week with Judy in the flesh, and Judy and I will return in the ether the week after. And trying to get our head around it, we should just carry on as we've always done. Every other week we show up here. And we should allow other people to worry about 5-week months and other things.
Oh, sorry, can I
Yes.
just say, our church quiz on the
Oh, yeah.
16th, it's not chips. Martin had possibly chips. It's going to be baked potatoes with fillings, and then we are going to do cakes because I'm in charge of cakes because I like cakes. So I've agreed to sort of supply cakes and the afters, the sweet side of things. So feel free to just turn up on the night. It's £8. We've sorted that out. It's £8, including the refreshments, and it's the 16th, 4 o'clock. It's a Saturday, 4 o'clock. We'll be eating about 5:30, and everybody very, very welcome. But you need to tell me fairly soon because of catering and cake. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you,
Cake.
and
Thank you.
good luck to Jonathan and Judy next week. Getting started from scratch is quite fun.
Yeah.
Hope it goes well.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.